Welcome back to another episode of the Junkyard Dawgcast. I'm your host, Jordan Hill. Got Kipp Adams with me on this Tuesday afternoon. Ben Wolk should be joining us in a little bit. Got a lot to discuss on today's episode. The Georgia Bulldogs are grinding through the offseason, going through winter workouts. A lot to get into on that front. We'll be talking about the Senior Bowl and the Shrine Bowl, several former Dogs involved there. We'll talk about Georgia's Junior Day that is upcoming, some of the people we expect there. And we will also just talk a little bit briefly about baseball and then close things up with UGA hoops ahead of a really big game on Tuesday night. But Kipp, let's start with the news from late Monday night. I don't know that this was necessarily a surprise, but clean old-fashioned hate is going to be on Black Friday for the second straight year. This year's game between Georgia Tech and Georgia, which will be played in Atlanta's Mercedes-Benz Stadium, is going to get the Friday night treatment. I want to get your thoughts, Kipp, on that news. I thought the first edition on Black Friday was a success. It was, I think, a pretty enjoyable experience for everybody, although Georgia cut it super, super close, a lot closer than people expected. But what do you think about this game being on Black Friday again and what we'll see by the time November gets here?
We thought it was a no-brainer before the game even took place. I mean, this made sense for, obviously for Georgia Tech. It's more national exposure, but Kirby, said the same thing for Georgia, though, just to have, that it be the game that day and be the focal point. The fact that it was at night at home obviously was huge for him at the time. But even, in Atlanta now, knowing that this game will be at Mercedes-Benz, Kirby's never going to shy away from any opportunity to play there. But I think once, you had that kind of game that Georgia and Georgia Tech had, just a historic 8 overtime game where, for us covering it, it was just pure nightmare fuel because, there were thousands of words deleted from the stories for this game, the gamers. But from a fan experience, even though it's stressful, it's memorable. And when's the last time you could say that about clean old-fashioned hate, that you had a memorable game? Since Kirby's came on board, yeah, it's been pretty one-sided. But at the same time, none of these games have really been ones where you're really talking about it at the end of the year. You're not really looking at the schedule and circling that date and going, oh, man, that's the game I can't wait for. It's not exactly at the front of the, the season ticket holder expectations, as far as ticket value. But, that game, I mean, people talked about that game for a long time. They're still going to talk about it for better or for worse. And I think having it on Friday just makes too much sense for both programs. So I think regardless of the outcome of the next game, just having it, in Mercedes-Benz, having it on Friday, I think this should be just the way it is moving forward.
I totally agree. I think it's a no-brainer, like you said, to leave it the way it is. You made a good point on the board that this could be beneficial for Georgia if they take care of business in SEC play. If with this game being in Mercedes-Benz Stadium, that would be the first opportunity for some of these freshmen, some of these transfers to have played there ahead of that game if Georgia is in the SEC title game again. And yeah, I mean, you put this game in a spotlight. It's a game that, like you said, it had kind of lost its luster because Georgia has been so dominant and because Georgia Tech for the last few years had been down. I think Brent Key's done a very good job, one, of bringing that program back up, but two, bringing some fire into this game, bringing some intensity. I mean, they pushed Georgia to the wire and, almost had it, save for probably a Dan Jackson forced fumble right there at the 2-minute warning. I like this. It puts this game on a pedestal. For us, it's nice that we'll have another Saturday to watch some football the next day, but I can understand some fans not liking the change, even going back to last year, but I think it makes too much sense. I think this is definitely the way both teams should have gone.
You mentioned a great point. I think just the fact that you, as a fan or as a writer, you get to sit back and just enjoy Saturday in the middle, late in the season, but It's a lot of rivalry games the day after, so it's basically like a holiday weekend for Georgia fans. As you know, assuming the game on Friday doesn't go over into Saturday again, you get to wake up rested and just have a full day of football, not stressed about what's going to happen with your team. So I think that's also a unique experience. And for Georgia, they get that day of rest. They get the extra rest. If they are preparing to play in Atlanta, then that'll be just another benefit of just the game continuing to be on Friday. Also, assuming that Georgia Tech doesn't play Thursday the week before, you'll have the same amount of rest this time between the two teams. So I just think I can't really see any downside other than, fans don't like change often, or, in any sport, it takes some time to adjust. But I think once you have, you go through both teams, hosting the game, you adjust to that. I think that moving forward, this will be something that just makes this rivalry unique and stand out. When you have so many huge rivalries in college football, you want to give yourself any opportunity to stand out, but also just get some more juice back into this rival, which is exactly what happened last season.
Yeah, I mean, you looked at how many people watched that game and compare it to the last few years. I mean, it was no contest that it was the right decision moving this to Friday. And yeah, Kip, I'm going to see if I can get betting odds on that game going to overtime, because I feel like we've kind of jinxed it, being like, oh, you can relax on Saturday. Well, we may be up for another late one on Friday night again. Well, Kip, let's talk a little bit about winter workouts for the Georgia Bulldogs. They are staying busy. It's kind of wild to sit here and think about that, with the offseason going, we're still only probably like a month and a half away from spring practice getting underway, but Georgia's staying busy. Georgia is trying to make the most of the time right now of the offseason, as so many programs are. Wanted to pass along a few guys that I've heard some good things about. I posted this on the board. I think that was on Monday. Sokovi Wyatt is a guy that I've been hearing really good things about. He was someone, along with Nitro Tuggle, I was a little surprised they weren't more involved in their first year at Georgia. You saw there were times, I think Sokovi was in early in the Florida game. Nitro Tuggle had some run as the season went along, but just weren't really factors. It seems like Sokovi's really taken this offseason seriously and has made a real effort to get stronger. I saw people on the Junkyard were asking about, is he a willing blocker? I mean, I'm sure he's learned he has to be if he's going to play a role in this offense. And another guy, too, that I've seen some good things and heard some good things, London Humphreys. He's a guy that, it kind of hit me before last season. I thought there was a chance he would play a significant role, but understanding that he was just a sophomore, I felt like Georgia kind of looked at him, especially with the other pieces they had in the receiver room, and thought about him long term, to think that, maybe he doesn't play a huge role in year one, but that's not a reason to panic. And you think about all three of these receivers, Kip, we're talking about guys who are in this offseason going through their first full year as Bulldogs. How valuable do you think this time is for these second-year receivers? Again, London is a guy that is going to be a junior, but it will be his second year at Georgia. To have had this entire year at Georgia, to understand the expectations, and to realize how valuable this time of year can be for them.
I mean, you looked at anytime you saw any of these guys on the field last season, it seemed like they were, getting looked at and getting targets and having an opportunity to make plays. And, then you just sat there and wondered, and often on the Junkyard, the question came up like, why aren't these guys in the rotation more? And the answer was pretty much the same for all of them, is that, they got to know the playbook and know the proper routes they need to be running on these plays, because, I mean, Georgia runs a pretty extensive playbook. There's a lot to take in. And it's not just about what you're doing when the ball's thrown your way or running the correct route. It's about what are you doing when the ball's not going your way. It's pretty important out there on the perimeter, even though Georgia kind of struggled out there on the perimeter in terms of blocking and other things in the offense last season. So that is the one area where this offseason, these guys have a chance to really take huge strides in there, in being a part of the offense. And also you got a quarterback you want to get some chemistry with too. So I just think getting adjusted to the workout schedule and also just getting that chemistry when they're all throwing on their own, whether it's Gunnar Stockton or Ryan Puglisi. I think that's going to be huge just so that, Mike Bobo, Kirby Smart, and the coaching staff can trust these guys. And then that's really where it is. You got to earn the trust and be dependable. It's about stringing together consecutive good practices during the week, and that's how you get more snaps during the game. And I really think that these weeks right now leading up into spring is where you're going to see strides in that, to where, we're going to hear practice report from these guys that they're getting more and more reps with the ones. And I do think that the reps are there, even though Georgia's gotten some guys through the transfer portal that we expect to be in the 2 deep. I do think you're going to start seeing the rotation, extend up, maybe not to 8 to 10, but maybe more consistent 8 guys at the wide receiver position who they'll be able to count on. And I think that'll be huge because, whenever they shrunk the wide receiver rotation, you started seeing, guys getting more targets than maybe was most beneficial for this offense, and not just Arian Smith. I mean, we're talking a lot of guys across the offense who are inconsistent on a route-to-route basis. So being able to get the rotation with some of these younger guys, I think will do wonders for an offense that really lacked explosive playmakers last year.
You hit on the biggest thing to me, Kip. It's that last year, that rotation, there wasn't really much of one. I mean, and it seemed like in years before, previous years, they'd done a very good job of getting different guys involved. And one, it allowed different guys to play a role in an important, factor into the offense. But two, it kept guys fresh. It kept your top receivers where they still had something in the tank by the time we're getting to the fourth quarter of these games. And I felt like they were really dependent on Dylan Bell, Dominic Lovett, Arian Smith, and then just hoping for some more involvement. Mentioning Lennon Humphreys, he's a guy that got some run at some point, but it was mainly those 3 guys. So the other point I wanted to make too with these receivers, you kind of hope that having Gunnar Stockton, having him be the backup this past year, we're talking about receivers that hopefully had been working with him and getting on that same page. I have to imagine that's only going to be beneficial for those guys as they get ready going forward. We're going to bring in Ben Wolk. It seems like Ben had a nice little afternoon adventure. But Ben, we were talking about the receivers and that we've heard some really good things to this point in winter workouts. Jacoby White, London Humphreys, and talking about how valuable this time of year can be for those guys to get ready for a receiver room that is going to be very deep, but also look very different than it did this time last year. So what do you think about the challenge that those guys have during winter workouts, try to make the most of this time as a receiver and to try to play a factor in this year's offense?
Well, I mean, with the guys that you mentioned specifically, like, they're not clueless to what's been going on. They've seen what the receiver production was last year. They looked at what Georgia brought in among freshmen, transfer portal guys. Like, they know their jobs are on the line. Like, they got to have a good spring to be able to get where they want to get within the Georgia football program. I mean, you mentioned London Humphreys. He got some run this season. Jacoby White didn't get as much, but it's a guy that we've heard a bunch about dating back to off-season workouts last year, throughout the course of this season, and now as they've gotten into off-season stuff this year, someone that you all know I'm super high on in terms of his ability. I mean, there's nothing that he can't do as a wide receiver. Jacoby White's one of those perfect examples. If he was 5'11" instead of 5'8", no one would – I mean, he would have been probably scratching 5-star status. He does everything so well. He just is shorter. And I hesitate to say undersized because I think that's what people say when they talk about Jacoby. Because he's not undersized. He's just shorter. Like, he's built well. He plays football the right way, all those types of things. And this is the time of year for you to be able to establish yourself in the rotation. It's also important because we don't know exactly what the Georgia quarterback situation is going to look like beyond Gunnar Stockton. And there's going to be a lot of rapport building that needs to happen between those quarterbacks and all of these wide receivers. I will also call out, I'd heard this was probably happening, but I hadn't seen it until yesterday. Jacoby White has added hyphenated Helton to his last name. So it's going to say White Helton on the back of his jersey next season. And I don't know how many people know his backstory, but he was adopted recently legally, but he lived for a while with a teacher that taught at Cass Middle School, Cass High School, just salt of the earth family. I don't need to tell Sokovi's entire story because I'm sure at some point he'll get to speak with media and he'll probably be asked a bunch about it, but really cool backstory. And I just love the fact that he became formally adopted by them. I think it was on Christmas Eve or somewhere around there. And the fact that he's adding their last name to his jersey, just really cool story. Sokovi's just someone you root for.
Oh, for sure. And I made sure I talked to him for a few minutes at the Sugar Bowl Media Day. Him being at Cass High School, they were big region rivals with my high school Pickens. So I made sure and mention, I gotta rep those North Georgia, Northwest Georgia guys, and it'll be exciting to see what he's able to do this year and the role he is able to play. Well, guys, not all good news as far as winter workouts, prep for spring practice with the Georgia Bulldogs. We reported on Monday, Monroe Freeling is going to have shoulder surgery, probably going to be limited at the very least for spring ball. We'll see what he's able to do. I did want to mention, too, UGAsports.com has reported a couple other guys, Gabe Harris and Colton Heinrich, have also had surgeries. And I don't think this is anything to worry about long term. We see this every offseason where Georgia has guys, it's usually labrums. They have guys go get that repaired, probably miss the majority of spring, or at the very least be limited. But it is significant. And I think especially when we talk about Monroe, when we talked, I think on last week's episode about the positions we were the most worried about, one of the top ones is offensive line in my mind because of what they're losing. And now you have this question mark of Monroe probably not going to be able to do very much in spring ball and having to have other guys step up. Now, this will be an opportunity for some of those other guys to play some tackle. I think Kipp pointed this out when we posted the story, guys like Jaw Jackson, Bo Hewley, Jamal Merriweather. It's opportunity for them. So I'll start with you, Kipp. How concerned are you about this Georgia offensive line when it comes to the spring? Because, Monroe will be back by the time we're talking about the season. But how big of a loss do you think it will be with him probably not going to be an option once they get spring ball going?
I mean, I think big picture, not even a blip on the radar with him missing the spring. I mean, he was playing banged up. I think he initially got hurt. Was it the Georgia Tech game? Kind of played through it in the SC championship. I mean, he obviously played through it. You could see it kind of catch up to him in the Sugar Bowl. But there's a situation where a lot of guys would have surgery when it happened, but he kept playing through it. And I think that's a situation where as soon as, Georgia was eliminated, that was immediately he switched to go ahead and getting that surgery done. So getting him healthy for the season, huge for Georgia. You could just tell whenever he was healthy and out there, we thought that that was when the light was going to come on for the offensive line. When he came in, moved into the starting lineup, it was a different look for them. So, and you saw it with Ernest Green too. I think it's just health. The tackle positions really suffered, really inconsistent last season. And I think you could definitely spin this as a positive because the guys that I mentioned, that you just mentioned, as far as next man up, those guys need these reps. I mean, Bo Hewley and Jaw Jackson, obviously football's still new to him, but he played every game last season. He was a special teams guy. Well, this is a much bigger role. I mean, you're going to have an opportunity to get reps in the two deep every single practice this spring so that they could see whether or not he's going to be ready for this season. I think it's a big spring for Merriweather as well. He's a guy that can kind of help out inside or outside. Maybe he becomes kind of that swing guy. But I definitely think that going into the spring, this is a great opportunity for them. And it's also for Georgia for evaluation, like who are our best five? Do we need to move a guy, at the guard position out the tackle, or can we go with these guys? And so for Bo Hewley to kind of take that next step to kind of, the same path that Amaris Mims, that Broderick Jones took as being the swing guy and then, a potential starter in 2026, if not this season. I just think that this is a positive for Georgia because they're going to be able to get great data points and evaluation on the offensive tackle position so they can make sure they get the best 5 on the football field.
Ben, I want to kind of change the question for you and go off of what we were just saying. There are a few guys who will benefit and probably get more reps in spring because Monroe Freeling, again, at the very least, will be limited, may not be able to do very much at all. Is there one or two of those guys you're particularly interested in watching, guys that you're going to be really paying attention to when it comes to the potential tackles?
Well, anybody that could fill that extra tackle spot. I mean, I think Kipp did a great job of highlighting the guys that I would be focused on, like Bo Hewley, Jamal Merriweather, Jaw Jackson. Like, who are the guys that need reps, but also like the Bo Hewleys of the world. Like, he's been around for a while now, and we've wondered, when is he going to take this next step? Like, this is the offseason for that to happen. And then, you mentioned – Kipp mentioned a bunch of the swing guys that could play inside, could play outside. Georgia does a great job. I mean, even Monroe Freeling, as an example, like, got work inside and outside when he is repping in practices. And I think that now that just opens up for everyone. I mean, the name that comes to mind for me where it's like, if Georgia's offensive line is going to get where it needs to get to this year, I think Daniel Calhoun needs to be the guy that Georgia the reason they wanted him, the guy they expect him to be. You never can expect guys to come in as freshmen and immediately establish themselves in the offensive line. So I have no concerns about the role that he had as a freshman. In fact, I don't think you should want to have a program where you have freshmen coming in and making an immediate impact, because it just means that you're playing 18-year-olds up front instead of 21 and 22-year-olds, and that typically is going to have an influence on how productive your offensive line is. But Daniel Calhoun, I'm not trying to put any unnecessary pressure on him, but he's the guy that I look at and say, he has that nastiness to him. He has the ability to take Georgia's offensive line and the interior to that next level. And I think that because Monroe's going to be out, they are going to shift some things around throughout the spring, and that's going to give a guy like Daniel Calhoun an opportunity to make a difference. Now, that's not to say that other interior guys like, Micah Morris have dropped off or anything like that. That's just to say, like, Georgia recruits a guy like Daniel Calhoun, and they emphasize him as a freshman in high school, and they want him to come to Georgia the entire time that he's getting recruited because they know that he can be a year 2 impact type of guy. And I think that you're looking at the offensive line, like, you need him to be that guy with an edge that he can be. And I don't know how much Monroe's injury will add reps for him versus what he was already going to get, but he's definitely someone that I think needs to step up on this offensive line, and I fully believe will.
Yeah, I think it's going to be fascinating to watch that group. There's several groups on this team that it's going to be worth watching very closely. Hopefully we'll get some practice availability. We'll see what that winds up looking like when spring ball gets rolling. We will take a quick break, come back, talk about a big transfer portal visitor, talk about the Senior Bowl, the Shrine Bowl, talk about another big junior day for Georgia, talk a little bit about baseball, and then UGA hoops. All right, Ben, I'm going to throw it to you. You brought the news to our board on Monday night that former Ohio State defensive lineman Hero Kanu, I hope I'm pronouncing that right, you can correct me there, is visiting Georgia, actually doing so as we're recording this. So obviously we're still waiting to hear how this visit goes, but what can you tell the folks about this target and Georgia's involvement in his portal recruitment?
Well, you saying that makes me realize that I don't actually know how to pronounce his last name, because I was going to say Hero Kanu. So we'll try and cover all of our bases there. Maybe Kipp will come up with a third pronunciation at some point as well. But we'll get that one right for any future episodes that we do in the event that he's someone that we talk about. I think that it makes a lot of sense. Like, he was definitely, when he entered the portal, I think it was a very natural name where we all sort of looked and said, all right, Georgia's thin on the defensive line. We've talked a bunch about that. Terry and Ingram Dawkins surprised folks, I think, a little bit with going to the NFL draft early. You look around and say, who can potentially add some depth on the defensive line that has experience, has productivity, whatever that might be. I mean, he's coming from a national championship caliber program. And so I wondered whether Georgia would have interest. I hadn't really heard anything until last night. He was on an official visit to Florida and is making his way to Georgia. He's at Georgia today. I would assume he's already been on campus doing things all throughout today, but I know he was on his way to Athens last night after leaving that Florida visit. And I can't say definitively how, great of a chance I think Georgia has, but I think that Georgia's in a good spot. Like, they're getting a visit. I mentioned it on the board. Like, there are some interesting ties, like Heroes from Germany. He went to high school at Santa Margarita Catholic in California. Georgia just signed a guy, JJ Hanna, who's from Germany, went to Santa Margarita Catholic. My understanding, just through digging on some of this today, is there is familiarity between those two families. And that's not to say that's what the decision-making process is going to be based upon, but it definitely doesn't hurt Georgia's chances. And I think when you throw in, he's coming from a championship program, he probably wants to go somewhere that has the ability to be a championship program. I think that he wants to go somewhere that maybe he fits a little bit more into scheme than he did at Ohio State. I think he likes schematically what Georgia does with that 5 tech, but also allowing them to be flexible and do some different things in different packages. So it makes sense whether or not Georgia ends up signing him and he enrolls and is participating in spring practices. I don't have the answer to that yet, but I think Georgia, it makes a ton of sense for Georgia. And I think it makes a lot of sense for Hero as well.
Yeah, it fills a big need if he comes to Georgia, and I think even if they don't wind up signing him, Georgia's going to address need on the defensive line when we get to that spring portal. Kipp, hit us with that pronunciation. You threw it to us in the private chat.
Hero Kanu is
Nailed
the
it.
proper pronunciation. Never had a doubt there, Ben. And he is a guy that, he's familiar with Georgia. He took his official visit there, back in November 2021, and you look at the fact that he hasn't made a huge impact his first couple of seasons at Ohio State, but then you look at Georgia's depth chart and you realize it's not just about getting a guy that slides in as a day one starter. It is about the fact that Georgia is thin along that defensive front, and there is a cascade effect. Even if you get a guy that's the backup, 5 technique for Georgia, that's a huge benefit because it frees up, Gabe Harris to potentially get more snaps as the edge rusher. And other than the fact that it also just helps in your overall rotation, he's a junior, he's still getting better. I just think that it makes a lot of sense. If they can find an impact transfer in the spring, they're not going to say no. This has no impact on that. This is about going into the spring saying, I don't, want our guys getting worn out because we're having to rotate the same 2 or 3 guys in. I want to get productive practices out of this defensive line and see what kind of depth we have so that we can, attack the portal in the spring and see if they can get an edge rusher or a running back, maybe a quarterback. Those are positions they're still going to look at. But I just think he makes a lot of sense with familiarity. He's already visited Brandon Collier with the PP1 recruits. I mean, they know each other. And so I remember writing about him then. I think it's an intriguing defensive lineman based on his size and the fact that he's played at a major program for multiple years, even as a backup. That's got to have value to Kirby Smart as well, because he knows what it takes. And he knows what he's stepping into in the programs that he's looking at, Texas, Florida, Georgia. He is trying to go in and compete with other guys. He's not just trying to, go to a place where he slots in as the no-brainer starter on day one. And he gave one of the best quotes you're ever going to read to Hank South at Horns 24/7 after his visit to Texas. He was asked why he saw himself fitting in at Texas. He says, And, just trigger warning here. He says, I mean, shit, I could play football. That's it. That's why I could see myself there. And I just think that's just, again, he will always be up there for me because of that interview, and credit to Hank for putting that, there for everyone to read, because I just think, that's legendary right there. And he should move up the board for every program trying to get him just based on that.
That's the good stuff right there. Be sure to stay glued to Dawgs247.com these next few days. We will pass along if there's any news out of this visit. And I'll set you up here, Ben. We are getting ready for another big junior day for Georgia. Now, we're going to have a UGA recruiting show, the Stay Wolk UGA recruiting show on Thursday. So feel free to save some of what you want to talk about on that show. But what can you tell the folks who are watching and listening to this episode about what they need to know about this upcoming junior day for Georgia?
Yeah, well, much like the first one that we talked about, I mean, if you're getting invited to a Georgia junior day, you're a big time Georgia recruit. Like, I can't say definitively, like every single person that was on Georgia's junior days the last 2 weeks have a committable offer, but I think it's pretty safe to say in like 99% of cases, like if you wanted in, you could get in. Now, the timing of the recruiting cycle and things like that is probably going to delay announcements and commitments, just the way that the calendar works nowadays. But I think and like you mentioned, we'll talk about this way more in depth on the recruiting show. But I think you got to start with the running back position. I mean, they are bringing in Derek Cooper and Savion Hyder, who are possibly running back 1, running back 2 in this class. I mean, Savion Hyder is the number 1 ranked running back in the 24/7 Sports recruiting rankings. Derek Cooper's listed as an athlete, so that sort of skews where I think he's the number 4 athlete. I think if he was ranked as a running back, he would be the number 2 running back right behind Savion, because I think he's like 2 spots behind him in the overall rankings. So we talked last junior day about the 3 running backs that they were bringing in: Javion Osborne from out of state, and then Carson Baker and Jay Lamar from in-state. This is maybe putting my neck out a little bit too much without quite enough information on it, but I feel as though Georgia's going to sign 2 guys out of that group of 5. Like, you just look at the way that they're recruiting them, the relationships that they've built, the visits that are recurring over and over again. Like, that's the 5 that Georgia's really keying in on. Now, they've offered some other guys. I'm sure that they'll get some on spring practices. Wouldn't even surprise me if somebody that I haven't listed in those 5 takes an official visit to Georgia. But just the priority level that it feels like Georgia is taking with those 5, and that those are reciprocating, feels like Georgia's in a really good spot to land 2 of those guys. Last junior day, there wasn't a ton on the defensive back front. Travaris Robinson and Dante Williams really wanted to emphasize having as many defensive backs together as they could to try and build that camaraderie and culture within the secondary. And so there were even some guys that had been planning to be at the original junior day that they rescheduled to February 1st. So I'll just list a few of them out. Jira Edwards, number 1 safety in the country, Dorian Barney, Nasir McCoy, Tyreek Green. Those 3 are all in-state guys. Jordan Smith is another safety from Houston County. His teammate, Kayvon Conciaro, was on a visit at the beginning of the junior day period. So Georgia's trying to make some headway down at Houston County. Peyton Dyer from Duluth High School. Tony Forney from Kell was one that was going to originally be on the first junior day, but rescheduled for this. And then Javari Flowers is one that I've learned about this week as well. There's way more people that are going to be visiting, even some that you could even consider more high-profile recruits. But I just think, given that Georgia took 1 running back last cycle, and not that Trevor Etienne was going to be around after this year anyways, but him leaving early, I just think it adds a little bit of focus onto the running back room and Josh Crawford's management of what he's going to put together in the future at that position. So I just think this is a big cycle there. And then defensive back, we talked a lot last cycle about how Travaris Robinson and Dante Williams were later to being added to the staff, and it took a minute for some relationships to be built. And just because of the top 100 guys that they brought in the 2024 cycle at corner, it was going to be difficult to bring people in the 2025 class. But I think they're going to look to make some home runs. There's a great crop of in-state talent at defensive back this cycle. And they've already, last junior day, they had Chauncey Kennan, the number 1 corner. This junior day, they've got Jira Edwards, who I think is the number 1 safety, but I might be slightly off on where he's ranked right now, but a highly rated safety in the 24/7 Sports rankings. And so they're clearly trying to combine elite now national cornerback and safety play with what they already have as in-state possibilities. And I think that it should end up as a good recruiting class for Georgia at defensive back.
Be sure to stay glued to Dogs 24/7. Ben's going to have you covered there, and also watch and listen to the Stay Wolk UGA recruiting show on Thursday. That'll be out. Ben, it's kind of changing the subject a little, but it just hit me, and I wanted to bring this up. Can we talk about Juan Gaston? The big boost he got in recruiting. Can you just talk about what this means and how he's impressed people ahead of his freshman year?
Well, I'm glad you said as much as you did, because it's not officially released until tomorrow at noon. So just know, tune in around tomorrow at noon, and you might hear some positive news on Juan Gaston. We've talked a lot about him. He was arrow pointing up for me in my first Stay Woke UGA recruiting show, so I sort of have teased it already as well. But yeah, Georgia fans should be super excited about having Juan Gaston on campus. Let's just leave it at that.
What a pro. What a way to handle that. And you guys stay glued, because you'll be happy with what you see. All right, guys, let's talk about a big week for several former Georgia Bulldogs. You have the Shrine Bowl and practices going on there. That game will be played on Thursday. And then you have the Senior Bowl down in Mobile that will be played on Saturday. Looking at the people who are participating at these games, for the Senior Bowl, the Georgia guys, Trevor Etienne, Arian Smith, Ty Ingram Dawkins, Smile Munden, Dan Jackson. And then in the Shrine Bowl, Dom Lovett, Ben Urasic, Xavier Truss, Nazir Stackhouse, Warren Brinson. There's a few other guys between those games that have wound up not participating. Jared Wilson, Tate Ratledge for the Senior Bowl. And then I saw today that Chaz Chambliss has been a little banged up, so it does not sound like he's going to participate in the Shrine Bowl. But I'm going to start with you, Kipp. When you look at the list of guys, former Georgia Bulldogs, who are getting ready to play in these games, is there one or two that you're particularly interested in? Guys you're paying attention to with what they do and the opportunity they have to prove themselves to NFL front offices before this game is played?
Well, you had already brought attention to one of the players on the board who stood out to ESPN's Matt Miller as dominating today, and that's running back Trevor Etienne. And it makes sense because they're doing, just passing drills right now, and one-on-one with a linebacker. Trevor Etienne's going to win every one of those matchups. So I think that setting, compared to maybe some of the other running backs out there, he's probably going to shine and improve his stock. And I mean, it's a huge week for him. He's going to have to take take advantage of every setting he has, every data point he can to impress NFL scouts, because again, he didn't really, have the season that he expected or anyone expected from just an overall workload standpoint. He had 3 seasons of kind of similar touches, low 100s, not really a workhorse running back, which, overall is good for him. You get to the league with fresh legs, but as far as trying to get, to be a guy that gets taken before maybe the 4th or 5th round, it's a huge week for him. And I think he does have potential to get into that, 3rd round discussion. The other guy, Smile Munden, another guy that, again, when he was on the football field, he was a blur. Just flying to the football, got banged up there toward the end the last couple of seasons and wasn't really able to take that next step when you thought, okay, this guy is a tackling machine. He's probably going to, lead Georgia in tackles. He could be a guy that has, 80 or 90 and really just couldn't stay on the field. So I just think this week's big for him. And I think a lot of scouts are probably going to look and say, wow, this guy's really athletic and just, flies all around the football field. So I could definitely see him being a stock up guy after Senior Bowl week.
Ben, what about you? Is there anyone in particular among these Bulldogs that you think has a really good opportunity to turn some heads at these All-Star games?
Well, it feels to me like when everyone actually sits there and watches Dan Jackson play football, they believe that he's a great football player. And I would be willing to guess just where he's been on mock drafts and what his profile was coming into playing college football, and people didn't really know about him, that there's a lot of folks that haven't watched enough Dan Jackson film. And it's not a knock on them. Like Georgia didn't, know about him when he got to campus. Like, he wasn't a guy that was thrust immediately into the rotation, but he just plays great football. Like, he knows how to play the game of football. I don't know what testing they do beyond measurables down there, so I don't know if he's going to do any of that, but anything that he tests in, I think he is going to test way better than people expect him to. Like, he's going to run really, really well, whether that be at a combine or a pro day. I don't know what opportunities he's going to get, but I just think that he's someone that's going to get down there. We've seen it with a couple of other DBs in the past. I mean, Tyke Smith was this way. He goes down to the Senior Bowl, and all of a sudden it's like, oh, this dude really knows how to play football. Now, in Tyke's case, he was a former All-American, so it shouldn't have surprised folks maybe as much as it did. But a lot of what you see down there in Mobile this week, I think, translates to early NFL success. Like, a lot of the guys that go down there and play really well throughout that week end up playing pretty early in their NFL careers. And I think Tyke Smith was a great example of that went, maybe got overlooked at times at Georgia, gets down there, everyone realizes what kind of football player he is, boosts his stock. I have no idea what Dan Jackson's draft stock is going to end up being, but I think that if someone buys into him and takes a chance on him, they are going to get good production out of him. Like, that's just sort of, what he's always been. Anyone who has watched Dan Jackson film is like, man, this dude looks like he plays on Sundays, because that's just the way that he is. And I'm interested to see how many scouts that maybe haven't exposed themselves to Dan Jackson as much are going to get down to Mobile this week and say, dang, this is a guy that's going to be on our board now.
I'm going to throw out a guy that's actually at the Shrine Bowl, and it's Nazir Stackhouse. He's a guy, if you guys remember, when he decided to come back to Georgia for the 2024 season, there were folks saying, I think he could have been picked in the first 3 rounds had he left and gone pro for the 2024 draft. So he's a guy that I think very highly of. He's a guy that I think could have fit right in, playing in that Senior Bowl and being down there in Mobile with some of those other Georgia guys. But I'm a big believer in Nazir Stackhouse. I'm always going to, shout out those defensive linemen, especially those nose tackles who, you look at his stats, they don't pop off the board. And I don't really remember him getting a ton of all SEC love, any kind of All-American talk, anything like that. But so much of what Georgia's defense, and especially that front seven, what they do depend on the job Nazir Stackhouse does. So I'm watching Nas. I want to see what he does. I'm a big believer in Nazir Stackhouse. I think he's got a chance to up his draft stock. And I think we'll hear about him quite a bit as we're getting closer and closer to April's draft. All right, talk a little bit about a few other Georgia sports before we get ready to close this thing out. Georgia baseball, they are ranked number 4 by Perfect Game in their preseason poll, number 11 in Baseball America. I wanted to take this opportunity to shout out Olivia Sayer, who is coming on board to cover Georgia baseball for us. We will have her on this podcast as the season gets underway, probably some preseason stuff as well. We are still a couple of weeks away from the season starting there. But, guys, this is an exciting time for Georgia baseball. Wes Johnson had a really strong first season. Olivia's first story was about some of the big moments in Coach Johnson's first season in Athens. But excited to follow this season, and super excited to see what Olivia brings to the site.
No doubt. Yeah, no, go follow her for baseball coverage. She's done a great job. She's done it in the past for the Red and Black and for other sites as well. So I know we have been absent of baseball coverage at times. That's not going to be the case anymore. We're super excited to have her on, and there's no better time. This seems like the year for us to dive headfirst into baseball coverage.
No doubt about it. All right, UJ men's basketball minute. A rough week for Georgia basketball. They lose at Arkansas 68-65, a game that they led by, I want to say, 15 at one point in the second half. But Arkansas makes a run and comes back and wins that game. And then just a really poor showing in Gainesville on Saturday, 89-59 loss at Florida, number 5 Florida, a game that was really never close. Georgia with 18 turnovers, 14 in the first half. Very sloppy game. Georgia now with a 4-game losing streak, 2-5 in the SEC. And as we record this on Tuesday, a humongous home game on Tuesday night hosting South Carolina, one that Georgia really needs to get back on track to end this losing streak and get ready for some brutal games coming up. And the next one on Saturday at Alabama. But Ben, I wanted to set you up. You were someone who posted quite a bit on the board in our thread during the Florida game when it was doom and gloom. Woe is me. Why are we playing basketball? I was very much on your side with your thinking on this. Obviously, Saturday was not pretty against a top 5 team, but there's no reason to go ahead and call off the season with where Georgia is right now.
Yeah, well, what do they call them? The Disney Dogs. I'm going to be called a sunshine pumper for the way that I describe this. Let me say, before I get into my sunshine pumping, let me say, like, I understand laying an egg at Florida doesn't feel good. Like, I understand leading by 15 at Arkansas and losing the game doesn't feel good. And they are not, like, there's not things that I'm trying to spin positives out of those specific results and the way that those things unfolded. But I think that we talked about this on the podcast a couple of weeks ago. You looked ahead at the schedule. You're going on the road at Tennessee. You're up 1 on the road at Tennessee and end up losing. If you're leading on the road at Tennessee and lose, you can live with that. You come back home. You lose by 2 to the number 1 team in the country. It's like you can lose by 2 to the number 1 team in the country and live with that. You want to steal one on the road, but it is so hard to win road games in the SEC, in college basketball. Like, just look across the country and find me examples of teams consistently winning on the road. Like, if you are consistently winning on the road, you are a 1, 2, 3 line type of team in the NCAA tournament. And feel what you want about this team or the progress that this program is making. Georgia is not yet at a roster or a program, and nor should they be, that's a 1, 2, 3 line type of team in the NCAA tournament. You're just not. You have to be realistic about where you should be in year 3, which everyone kept doing that on the board. They kept saying that it's year 3. Should you not expect to have a point guard? It's like, yeah, like, is there a world where you have a point guard that is a true point guard that's facilitating an offense and not turning the ball over? Yeah, sure. Like, in an ideal world, yes, but those guys don't just grow on trees. And guess what? Auburn, Tennessee, Florida, Alabama, like, they want to have those guys too. And so when Georgia goes on the road and plays these teams, in no world should you ever expect to win them. Like, what happened in the Georgia-Florida game? Would you have liked to keep it closer? Yeah, sure. Guess what? Florida did this exact same thing to Tennessee a couple of weeks ago. Like, I hate to say it because I know no one likes to pat Florida on the back. They have an unbelievable basketball team this year. There's probably a reason why their coach gets caught up in some off-the-field stuff, and they go to bat for him because they realize, like, this is a great basketball team that they have. Walter Clayton is probably my favorite player in the country to watch. You talk about a guard that can do it all, control an offense, like, that's Walter Clayton. They've got bigs that can do it. I saw this stat and then someone corrected me that I might have been slightly off on this. So I'm going to throw it out again, and it might be slightly wrong as well. But there's not a single person in their rotation that has a wingspan under 6'7". So when you're a team that can score 85 points a game and defensively you're going to be able to bring that length, it's going to be hard for teams to beat you, period. It's going to be especially hard for teams to beat you at home. Now, Missouri somehow upsets Florida at home. I think that's when you start looking ahead to Georgia's schedule. Vanderbilt's a little bit better than people think that they are. Missouri's a little bit better than people think that they are. Like, those are 2 home games. Now, Georgia really has to win to be able to find the wins that they need. And so all of that, rant to say, the hardest pill to swallow is obviously the Arkansas game because you're up 15 and Arkansas was 0-5 in the conference when you're going into that game. But again, Georgia was a road underdog going into that game. Them losing that game, just the way college basketball goes and the way betting odds typically tend to be pretty reflective of how things go in college basketball. Like, you shouldn't probably have been expecting to win that game. Now, if you had stolen a game or two there in that 4-game stretch, I think you are sitting pretty for the NCAA tournament. So what hurts is not the result of those games to me in terms of it hurting your resume. I mean, Georgia started out that stretch 28th in the net rankings. They're down to 34th. So they lost 4 straight games, and they dropped, but they barely dropped after losing 4 straight. So in terms of how they're viewed by the committee right now, almost not different whatsoever from when they started that 4-game skid. What it does mean is tonight, Tuesday night against South Carolina, is a must win. And it sucks to say that because if you lose it, it's like the whole outlook on the entire season, is done, it feels like, but you have to win. You cannot suffer a quad 2 loss at this point in time in the season. You just can't. Missouri probably will end up being, even as a home game, will probably end up being a quad 1 game. So it doesn't hurt you a ton if you lose it. But Missouri, Mississippi State, Vanderbilt, like these are the home games left, and they're not gimmies. And when you look at the road games, like you're not, I'm just going to call it right now. You're going to get your ass beat against Alabama on Saturday. Cover your ears if you're a child that's listening to this. But it is, if you're not a child that's listening to this, like open your ears and accept the reality. Like you don't go to Tuscaloosa for a Saturday night game and find success. You just don't. It doesn't matter if you're Georgia. It doesn't matter if you're Kansas. It's a hard thing to do. Like it's just the reality of the world. And so you have to sort of look ahead and say, all right, at Alabama, at Auburn, even coming back home against Florida, like you're not feeling great about some of the look ahead games. So you got to circle the spots. Like what's winnable? Where can you get to 20 wins? Because I think for Georgia, like getting to a certain SEC number is important. But I think if you can find a way to get to 20 wins, I think you clinch your spot. You can probably clinch your spot with 19 and maybe a win or two in the SEC tournament. But we're definitely at the point in the season now where it's like, all right, Georgia's, 14-6, 14. So you're 14-6. There's not a ton of wins left out there. It feels like there should be more wins left out there, but that's just the nature of basketball in the SEC right now. But regardless of how it plays out, undeniably, there are improvement signs year over year from last year to this year. Are there still flaws that this team has? Yes. Like, would they like to turn the ball over less? Yes. Would they like to shoot at a higher clip from perimeter? Yes. Are there things that they just got abused on last year, rebounding, that they're not getting abused on this year? Yes. So they solved issues. It's just when Mike White came into this program, they were a 6-win basketball team. There was not an issue that the program did not have. And so he has gradually had to solve each of those things year over year over year. And I think that this team is a much better version of itself than last year's team was, even if you can still go on the road and, get beat by Florida by 30. That's going to happen sometimes. Guess what? Georgia's eventually going to have a team that is a consistent tournament team, or I'd like to think that they're going to eventually have a team that's a consistent tournament team, and they're going to be in the upper echelon of the SEC. And there are still going to be years that they're going to go on the road and lose by 30 to other really good basketball teams. That's how it is in college basketball. I covered an Auburn Final Four team that the last game of their regular season, they went and lost by 30 to South Carolina when South Carolina wasn't good, and they turn around, win the SEC tournament, make a Final Four run. Like sometimes that just happens. Playing college basketball on the road is really, really tough, and even the best teams suffer from that from time to time, especially when you don't shoot well from the perimeter, which Georgia just doesn't shoot well from the perimeter. And we talked about this, Jordan, at the beginning of the season. Like the Achilles heel of this team is going to be guard play. It is going to be shooting the ball consistently. And they just haven't done that in these crunch time moments. And when you play teams like Florida and Auburn and Tennessee, it's going to be really, really hard to play well.
Ben, I'm so glad that you blessed us with that rant. And yeah, I mean, you made a point that Mike White has made really since the loss at Florida, that, I mean, they really don't have a bad loss on their schedule. People were like, oh, they should have won at Arkansas. That was still a quad 1 game with that being at Arkansas. But to bring back to the point that you hit on, and I mentioned as well, they have to win on Tuesday against South Carolina. And I want to make this point. South Carolina is 0-7 in SEC play. They're the last SEC team without a conference win. They are playing everybody incredibly close. 4 of their last 5 losses have been by no more than 5 points. So I'm expecting this one to be tight, and I'm expecting that Georgia has to do the little things right to win it. Not turning the ball over, hitting free throws, not taking ill-advised 3-point shots when this is just not a strength of this team. So I think it's too early to write this team off and say, oh, it's not worth watching. They're going to have some big battles ahead. I mean, you mentioned some of the road games, Ben, but I look at at Texas before the season and really early on in conference play. I was like, okay, that might be one that Georgia can win going to Austin. I don't see it now because Texas is coming on. They just beat A&M. I think they beat Missouri in the midweek last week. It's going to be tough, and I think something to keep in mind too with what Georgia does in these upcoming games. I think that SEC tournament is going to be huge in their postseason hopes. They need to make a little run just based on what I see ahead for Georgia. But that's not to say they can. I thought they played well in the 2 games in the SEC tournament last year, lost close to a really good Florida team. So 7 p.m. Eastern time on Tuesday, SEC Network, Georgia, South Carolina. I'll be there for that. Kipp, you got any thoughts on the state of Georgia men's basketball?
I had a lot of great points, and I forgot them about 7 minutes into Ben's monologue there. But I will say that this game against South Carolina is the most winnable game still left in the schedule, even though they're playing everyone tough. It's the only quad 1 team they're really gonna play the rest of the season. And if you look at the projections, Georgia's still favored to win 6 more games. All right. But the margin for error there is 0. They have to win every game they're favored in. And then the 2 of the games that they're favored to win, I mean, they're coin flip games. That Mississippi State game and the Missouri game is, I mean, it's going to be the line on those games is going to be 1, maybe 2 points. So it is going to come down to, as you said, those fundamentals. Every single possession is going to matter for Georgia if they want to accomplish the goals they set out before the season. And they still have that. It's still right there in front of them. They haven't, I mean, again, there's no non-quad 1 loss that they have, but they have to stack together some quad 1 wins as well, just to be able to give themselves a little bit of leeway and not need a tornado in the SEC championship game to get them into the tournament. So I think they have a shot. It's a situation where they do kind of have to show something they haven't shown so far, which is that you can make better shot selections and that you could, drain those free throws. 71% as a team, it's pretty abysmal. I don't know if it's better or worse than the 32% they're shooting from 3. But that's something where they need to be spinning in, from, sunrise to sunset. That's what they should have been working on since the Florida game. And tonight is a great opportunity for them to show everyone, we're still, eyes on the prize here. And we still know that we have an opportunity to go 6-5, make some hay in the SEC tournament, and then, punch our ticket into March Madness.
I think they need at least 7 conference wins to feel like they got a good shot. And even then, I think you would probably want at least a game in the SEC tournament. And, looking at the schedule ahead, Kipp made the point about this matchup with South Carolina in Athens and what a great opportunity it is. 7 of Georgia's final 11 games of the regular season are against teams that, as we're talking on Tuesday, are ranked. And then it's really this South Carolina game and then next Wednesday against LSU at home. Those other 2 are at Texas, who isn't ranked, and at South Carolina toward the end of the regular season. You need the South Carolina game. You also need that home game against LSU. All right, boys, before we finish and sign off on this episode, Ben, I want to set you up to tease just a little bit of the upcoming Stay Wolk UGA recruiting show. What can folks keep an eye out for, whether they watch or listen to Thursday's show?
Well, for anyone that doesn't know what we're talking about when we say the Stay Wolk UGA recruiting show, we launched our first episode earlier this month, really wanting to give you a Junkyard Dawgcast episode that goes in depth into recruiting. So for anyone that's hardcore recruiting fan, wants to follow at this time of year, we want to be able to talk all things recruiting all the time throughout the episode. And then it's really important to us to have some interviews as well, just to give you some insights into signees, recruits, maybe coaches, whoever it might be in the Georgia sphere that would make sense to be able to talk to. So if you haven't listened to the first episode, I encourage you to go back and listen or watch on YouTube. We had an interview with Talon Taylor, who's now enrolled as a Georgia football wide receiver signee. On Thursday, we will have Lincoln Keys, who is a tight end that's committed to Georgia. Sat down with him for about 20 minutes. He's awesome. You're going to thoroughly enjoy the chat with him. We'll also give you some news and recruiting updates on Thursday, and then we'll, have some fun segments for those of you that haven't listened yet. We have some fun after the interview as well. So encourage you to check that out on Thursday at noon. Is that what we decided? All right, Thursday at noon. I'll see everybody there.
If you're on the fence at all, I think it's worth watching just for the predicted commit segment. We may wind up looking foolish by the time this 2026 class comes together, but I think that's a great idea for Ben, and enjoyed being part of the first episode and looking forward to the one on Thursday as well. So we will wrap it up right there. I appreciate Kipp and Ben for popping on. Thanks to everyone who watched this live, everyone who is watching or listening to it after the fact. Go to Dawgs247.com and subscribe. As we mentioned earlier in this episode, it's a big week with a big transfer portal visitor on campus with the Junior Day stuff going on this weekend for Georgia. Go subscribe to the YouTube, to the TikTok, lots of good content there. And again, stay glued and keep an eye out on Thursday for that Stay Wolk UGA recruiting show. So we'll wrap it up right there. For Kipp Adams and Ben Wolk, I'm Jordan Hill. Until next time, take care, everybody.